Thanks to both of you for coming on. Dennis, let me start with you on the China part of this, which was what we saw in the markets over the last half an hour or so. There's the intraday chart of the Dow. We're coming back a little bit. We were down 150, we're down 135. But the idea, putting this $200 billion in place by next week, that the president wants to really stay tough on the Chinese. Your impression of that?
I think it's one of the silliest ideas I've ever heard of. I thought we had moved away from the idea of trade protection and trade tariffs. I think it is inconsequential. I think it is absolutely, utterly wrong that he's going through with this. To put this back on the table when you're in the midst of discussions with Canada about moving ahead with NAFTA makes no sense whatsoever. Let's hope that it is simply an ill-advised and a trial balloon. Let's hope it doesn't go through.
Let me go to the why on that. Lindsey, I'll get to you in 1 second. But let me go to the why on that from your perspective, Dennis, because the administration, I'm sure, would argue that this was all part of a larger plan, is that we want to do something with Mexico, with Canada, then with Europe, and then still be as tough as we possibly can on China. Why is it not a good idea? What's the why?
Tariffs are never a good idea. Trade protection is never a good idea. My wife tells me never to say never, but in this instance I will use the term never. It is far better to push ahead with diplomacy. It is far better to push ahead with trying to resolve these circumstances. Yes, we know that the Chinese do untoward things when it comes to trade. Yes, we know that they steal our ideas on a rather consistent basis. But the people who are going to be punished by this are going to be America's farmers, and we're going to create very few jobs out of it. So trade tariffs and trade protection are always a bad idea.
Lindsey, your take?
Well, I certainly agree that any time you talk about restricting the free flow of capital, labor, goods, services, it will result in a long-term loss of productive capacity for the U.S. And absolutely, we could be talking about job losses, income losses, and of course, price increases, which producers are going to try and pass on to the U.S. consumer. So no doubt there will be some pain felt depending on the depth and duration of this ongoing dispute with China. But looking at the market's reaction, I think it's very important that we do focus on the main issue here. Yes, we've taken steps to move this bilateral agreement to a trilateral agreement with Canada. There's progress being made, but the main focus is on U.S.-China relations, which still remain very uncertain and which are going to continue to really drive the optimism in the market. NAFTA, absolutely priced in that we might see a deal later this year, most likely a 2019 event, but it really comes down to how we negotiate and the end game with U.S.-China relations.
I guess the question becomes, I've had this conversation a lot over the last few weeks, really months, is that if we all agree that China's a bad actor in all of this, forget about Canada and Mexico and everybody else for just a second. We all agree, and both heads are nodding here, that China's a bad actor in all of this, and tariffs are not the answer. What is? Dennis?
Well, I suspect more negotiation, more diplomacy. And I know most people on the far right seem to think that that's ill-advised and it won't happen and it won't work.
Right.
But to me, I think it was Winston Churchill who said it is far better to jaw than to make war. And I think that putting into place more trade protection and more tariffs is a tantamount to trade war. And I just wish we would back away from that.
And Dennis caught himself there, Lindsey, and he's right that would be the answer from people that say, well, we tried that. We've tried that for years and it hasn't worked. So we've got to try something else. So what do you say?
Well, I think the Trump administration is struggling with that because we know that we lose billions of dollars in terms of intellectual property theft, and we do need to put protections in place to protect producers from counterfeit of goods. But it will be painful to get to that end goal. So this becomes a voter issue. Are voters willing to deal with that short-term pain in order to level the playing field in the longer term? That's a question that the Trump administration is struggling with, as negotiations and diplomacy really haven't led to much improvement in trade relations over the past decades.
And by the way, we get to this number. This came first from, or it's come to us from a Bloomberg report. We get to this number. This is, there's been a lot of argument back and forth. Are we in a trade war? I mean, this is a trade war, Dennis, right? This is what it looks like.
Well, that's what it looks like. Right now it's trade skirmishes, but my fear is that we tend to fall down these slippery slopes, and it's very difficult to retrace your position. And therein lies the problem. I've watched this happen far too many times. I've went back and looked into the history of the Depression and saw what we did there. And every time I've seen us talk about fair trade, it always becomes trade protection. I just fear that we will slide down that slope again.
Let me ask you guys
Let's hope we don't.
Right.
Let us hope we don't.
Well, of course. So
well, but you have to remember, we're not coming from a baseline of free trade. We're in a situation of managed trade. We have tariffs on hundreds of goods. So we're simply expounding on the current policies that are already in place. We do have to keep that in mind, that, again, we're not coming from a zero tariff standpoint, even on the U.S. side.
Even though we heard that term, by the way, thrown around today, that was different. That was had to do with European cars. What do you make, real quick, Lindsey, of the way the president's handled that part of it? And apparently he wants a broader deal with the Europeans than just the zero tariffs on autos. Do you think he's handled that part, Canada, Mexico, Europe, a little better than China, or no?
Well, he's continuing to apply the pressure, and he's said time and time again that, look, if everyone wants to play fairly and lower tariffs to zero, the U.S. is absolutely willing to put their money where their mouth is and go to zero as well. But we're not going to play this game of lowering tariffs on one particular item. He's saying we need a broad-based agreement on the exchange of goods and services, not just autos alone. So I do think he's keeping the pressure, and he's going to potentially get results.
All right, we do have to work a little break in here. The Dow's now down 113, so it's come off the lows. Dennis, thanks. Lindsey, thanks. Good to see both of you. Appreciate you both coming on.